You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fire Ecology Chats. This is a podcast for the journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is an internationally renowned journal that is published by Springer Nature and overseen by the Association of Fire Ecology. Today, we have two great people to come and talk about a very, very important issue. We have Nate Stephenson and David Soderberg. Nate, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Bob. I'm Nate Stephenson. I'm an emeritus scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Ecological Research Center, and I've been stationed at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks for 45 years.
Well, welcome, Nate. And David, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm David Soderberg. I am also a scientist for the USGS Western Ecological Research Station, just without the emeritus part to my name.
Well, the exciting topic we're going to talk about today is the paper effects of recent wildfires on giant sequoia groves were anomalous to millennial timescales, a response to Hansen et al. Nate, why don't you give us a little nutshell about what this paper is about?
Sure, I'm happy to. The star of our paper really is the giant sequoia, the world's most massive tree. And sequoias have a really small natural range. If you were somehow able to scrunch all of the world's sequoia groves together in one place, they'd cover an area that's less than a tenth the size of Los Angeles. But over the last decade, wildfires have burned across almost all of that range, killing an estimated 13 to 19% of all those sequoias. So we noticed that two recent papers suggested that these large high-severity wildfires, which also included areas of crown fire, were a normal part of giant sequoia fire regimes. This contradicted past research, which concluded that past sequoia fire regimes were dominated by frequent surface fires that left most big sequoias alive. So, among several things we do in the paper, our paper presents new evidence addressing a central question, which is at millennial timescales, were large patches of fire severe enough to kill most sequoias, like the recent wildfires did, a normal part of the giant sequoia fire regime?
That's incredibly interesting. Can you give us an idea of what that evidence might be?
Sure. We took advantage of the fact that sequoias don't resprout, unlike some of their relatives like the coast redwood. If a sequoia loses all or most of its foliage in a fire, it will die. So if you're walking through a sequoia grove and you see a living sequoia that's more than 1,000 years old, you know that that particular spot hasn't had a stand replacing fire for at least the last 1,000 years. That means you can assess the extent of past high severity wildfires by looking at the distribution of millennial age sequoias. But to do this, we needed to know the trunk diameters of millennial age sequoias. And fortunately for us, way back in the 19-teens, a group of Yale researchers carrying a bunch of hand lenses with them crawled across 458 sequoia stump tops and counted over 1 million annual growth rings on those sequoia stumps. We analyzed their data and found that millennial age sequoias are those with trunk diameters greater than about 10.5 feet or 3.2 meters. So we could then use that diameter cutoff, and we were able to show that at least before the recent wildfires hit sequoia groves, those groves had abundant millennial age sequoias, averaging about 2 per hectare. And we were able to examine some stem mapped sequoia groves also and found that they did not have any large areas devoid of millennial sequoias, which means there hadn't been any large stand replacing fires over at least the last 1,000 years and probably a lot longer. So we could conclude that the effects of the recent wildfires, some of which killed most or all sequoias across broad areas, were unprecedented at millennial timescales.
This is very important because I know that this paper was catalyzed by some findings of two other papers that were mentioned in the paper. These findings are incredibly important to the science and management of the species. David, I know this paper talked about a lot more than what Nate just talked about. What else did this paper address?
In addition to incorrectly suggesting that large high-severity fires were a normal part of these sequoia fire regimes, the two papers we critique also had some methodological problems in how they assessed these post-fire seedling densities. Something we can share is that I think these issues are something that we can all learn from. One issue is the use of means versus medians for estimating landscape scale seedling densities. In the paper, we show that one reason medians are inappropriate is because medians depend on the size of your sample plots. So your median value actually systematically increases as your plot size increases. While on the other hand, your mean seedling density is actually independent of plot size, and the mean will give you a consistent result across a variety of sampling schemes. We also said that the size of your plot is also really important when you're sampling seedling densities that are highly variable at fine spatial scales, as is the case for many mixed conifers, especially giant sequoia. And so we go on to argue that our use of large plot sizes led to more credible estimates for several reasons. The first is that surveying larger areas better captures that inherent patchiness of seedlings in the landscape. For example, compared to these other studies, our data had just an eighth of the among plot variance. Also, using large plots reduces the potential for error bias in your plot placement when you're out in the field, where just these small unconscious adjustments in the placements of plots when they're really small could lead to huge swings in your density estimates.
That's pretty incredible that all the findings are statistical anomalies, statistical reasons why we should have increased the plot size and so on. That's really important. So, David, what do all these results mean for fire management?
Yes, the work we're continuing to do is a direct response to the needs of the Giant Sequoia Land Coalition, which is a group that includes the Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, local tribes, the state of California, and local counties. All of these groups have had to respond to these recent wildfires by deciding if and where to apply fuels treatments, and also within these severely burned areas, if and where to plant sequoia seedlings. And what we wanted to do here was to provide critical assessments that contributes to the decision making they'll have to do.
Wow, thanks. I want to thank both of you, Nate and David, for coming and joining us here and talking about your very interesting paper. Nate, is there anybody you want to recognize as far as co-authors and funding agencies?
Yeah, and thank you for having us. Other key contributors to the paper were our co-authors, which are Josh Flickinger and Tony Caprio of the National Park Service and Adrian Doss of the USGS. And we also really certainly want to thank the USGS and the National Park Service for funding that made our work possible.
You can thank Tony, and we'll really miss him here. It was a great paper, and thank you for talking all about it. For listeners, if you want to read this paper, guess what? You can download it for free from our website. Yes, I said free. Nate and his group have already paid the freight for looking at this paper, and you can look at it at no cost. So please download the paper today, and I also encourage you to come to our next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. fireecology.org.